Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be going over our database structure. We're going to be going over setting up Entity Framework. We're going to set up our Postgres database server using Docker. And yeah, it's going to be full of a lot of good stuff. So let's go ahead and jump in. So what is our database going to look like at first? Well, at first we're going to have two tables. The posts table, which will have an ID, which will be its primary key, and that'll be of type GUID. GUID stands for Global Unique Identifier. You could generate millions and millions and millions of these GUIDs and never run into any kind of collision. That's why we're using a GUID for that. We're going to have text, which is going to be a string. That's the content of our post. For now, we're going to be using the user handle as well. We're going to be using that user handle to track what user owns the post. Since we don't have authentication or authorization set up yet, we're going to just be kind of faking it with this user handle for now. Then we've got this isPublished flag, and that's going to be set to true if the post is published and publicly visible, and set to false if it's in draft mode. And then we've got created@, which is simply when the post was created. And then last edited, which is a nullable date time, which will be set if the user changes something about their post, like whether or not it's published or if they change the text. All right, then we've got this likes table over here. It's got a user handle. Again, that's temporary. We'll be replacing that with a user ID once we have our user stuff set up. And a post ID, which is that same GUID. All right, so the post ID is going to tie back to an ID in the post table. Now, if you notice, we don't have a primary key defined on this likes table. That's because we're going to be using a composite key for the primary key. And what that means is we're going to be using a primary key that has two fields, the user handle and the post ID. Now, a composite key can have more than two fields, but for our purposes, it's just going to be the two. And the reason we're doing that is to make invalid state unrepresentable in the database, right? So if a user were to try to like a post multiple times, then the database will prevent us from inserting multiple like records into the database with the same user handle and the same post ID, which is super important for a system like this. Otherwise, the user could boost their post's likes simply by hitting the like button 10,000 times. Right, so since it will be unrepresentable in the database, worst case scenario, it's going to throw an exception and return an error back to the user, which is fine in this case. All right, so enough of that. Let's jump into some of the code. So the first thing we're going to need to do is to go over here to NuGet, and we're going to be installing this NuGet package. This is the Entity Framework driver for Postgres. Right, so here we are in our microblogger.api project, and we're just going to say .NET add package, and then paste that on in. And you'll see it's compatible with all the specified frameworks in the project, which is exactly what we want to see. All right, so with that package installed, what does that give us? Well, it gives us access to a database context, which is how we interact with our database. It gives us access to the Postgres driver for configuring our database context, and yeah, that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and create a new folder in here, and we're going to call it data, because that's where all of our data related stuff is going to live. We'll create another new folder inside of there called entities, and that's where our entities are going to live. So let's go ahead and create our entities. So it's going to be a class, and this one is going to be called post because it's going to represent our posts. We can delete this using system up at the top. We don't need it. Now you see here, the namespace is microblogger.api.data.entities. I'll probably point this out a lot of times because I feel like it's important to know. That represents where it is in our file system, microblogger.api.data.entities, right? And then the class is post, which matches the file name here. So we want, first off, a public GUID ID get set, right? And we said that this was going to be a primary key. So what we could do is we could just drop this key attribute on top of this ID field. But we're not going to do that. Why? Well, Entity Framework is very convention-based, and what that means is if you follow the rules of Entity Framework, you don't have to explicitly configure a lot of stuff. And one of those rules is your primary key should be named either ID or in this case something like post ID because it would match the class name with ID at the end. I like just using ID though. And that it will automatically get picked up as the primary key. All right, so then we're going to do a public string text get set. Now it's warning us that it's required, but we don't have any value set for it. So we're just going to do string.empty. All right, so now we had a public string user handle, and that's also going to default to string.empty. We had the public bool is published. Now the default value for a bool is going to be false. So by default, if we don't specify anything, then the user's post is going to be in draft mode, which is what we want, because if the user doesn't explicitly say, I want to publish this, then we probably shouldn't publish it on their behalf. Public date time created at get set. And now we're going to give this a default value so we don't have to specify it every time. So we're going to say equals datetime.specifyKind, datetime.utcnow, dateTimeKind.utc. So the reason we're doing that is the Postgres driver only supports date times that are of type UTC. So we have to explicitly tell C# that this is a UTC timestamp. All right. Then we're going to do public date time last edited at get set. And you notice we put a question mark here. That's because this is nullable. If a user hasn't edited their post, then it doesn't need to have a last edited at timestamp. All right, now let's just pop back over to our database diagram and make sure we got everything. We have the ID, we have the text, user handle is published, created at, and last edited. Perfect. So that's most of what we need for the post. We'll come back to it. So inside of our entities folder, we're going to create a new class, and this one is going to be our like. Feel free to take a pause here and create all the data you need for the like class. It'll be just 2 properties. We'll add a third later, but for now it's just the 2 properties. And yeah, see if you can get that taken care of. All right, so all we need here is we need the public GUID post ID because it refers back to our post and is the ID of the post. And then we need our public string user handle equals string.empty. All right, so that is our entities mostly configured. However, we have a little bit of a problem. So when we are loading up a post, we may want to load up also all of the likes for a post, right? Because we might want to count them, or we might want to say, hey, one of your friends liked this post. So how do we do that? Well, if we go into post, we don't have any property for grabbing the likes. Let's fix that. We're going to have a collection of likes because if you remember, it's going to be a one post to many likes type relationship. So it's an I collection of like called likes. And now it's complaining again that we don't have a default value. Well, we can't just set it to string.empty, right? Because that's a string, not a collection. So previously you would do something like this, new list like. And that works fine, right? But C# recently made it even easier to initialize an empty collection. You just do 2 square brackets. All right, so now we can go from a post to a like. However, we don't have a way to go back from that like to a post. So what we can do is we can go into here in our like class, and we can make a public post, which will be optional post. Now, what does this optional mean? Does this mean that we can have a post or a like that's not associated with a post? Well, not really. What this means is when we load the like from our database, we will get a post ID and we will get a user handle, but we may not want to load the post. Now, the reason we may not want to load the post is, say we are loading up a post, and then we're loading up the likes for that post. If we always loaded up the post, we would then load up the post for that like, which would include the likes for that post, which would include the post for that like, so on and so forth. So we get this circular reference, right? And we can't have those because we can't serialize that out. We can't really represent that successfully, and we would likely get a Stack Overflow exception if we went all the way down. So what this means is we may not load it from our database, but since this GUID, which is the post ID, is not nullable, it means we will always have our like associated with a post. Now, if you notice, this is called post, and this is called post ID. Now, if we called this liked post, then this would need to be liked post ID. This is another one of those conventions where Entity Framework is smart enough to see that we have a navigation property. That's what these properties that our other entities are called, are navigation properties. That is called liked post, so the ID for it must be called liked post ID. I'm going to rename this back to post ID and rename this back to post. The downside to the convention is that if we left this at liked post and left this at post ID, there's nothing that's going to tell us that we goofed up. At least not for another couple steps down the line. All right, so we have our entities defined. We can also get rid of this using system. We have our two entities defined. Now we need a way to interact with them and to interact with our database. So inside of our data folder, we're going to create another new folder called context, right? And that's where we're going to put what's called a database context. So it's going to be a new class, and it will be called Microblogging context. All right. So again, we can get rid of this using system. What we have here is our Microblogging context class. Right now it's empty and it doesn't do anything, but we're going to change that here. So what we do is we inherit with this colon, we inherit from DB context, right? And that should drop in this using Microsoft Entity Framework Core statement at the top. Now, if you hover over DB context, it'll tell you it's an instance representing a session with a database and can be used to query and save instances of your entities like our likes and our posts. DB context is a combination of the unit of work and repository patterns. Now, a lot of people will drop a repository on top of a context, and while that's not necessarily wrong to do, it's something that I personally don't do because the context already implements the repository pattern, so it's a bit of extra work for no real benefit. All right, so we need to be able to configure our context, right? We need to be able to tell it, hey, you're using Postgres. Hey, you need to log this kind of stuff. So how do we do that? Well, we can define a primary constructor here that has a DB context options, and that's of type Microblogging context. And we're going to call that options. Right, so it's complaining here that it's unread, so we never use this options, which is true for now. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pass it up to the DB context constructor. We're just going to say options. And that means we don't have to do anything with the configuration of the actual data source. It will all be configured by the DB context and the options that are provided to us. All right. So now we have a database context, but we don't have a reference to any of our entities in here. So let's fix that. What we need is a public DB set, and that's going to be of type post. And that's going to be called posts. And we're going to make this what's called an auto accessor property. And so we do equals then, greater than. And that essentially means, hey, this is a property, and it's going to be read only. Right, so we don't want somebody from outside of this context to set our posts property to be something. We want Entity Framework to be responsible for setting it. So in order to do that, all you do is set post. Right, and then we're going to do the same thing, public DB set, oops, Sometimes IntelliSense is a little aggressive. Light. And it's going to be called lights, and it's going to be a set of light. All right. So now we have references to our entities, and this is all we need to create our tables. However, we have a couple of rules that we want to enforce on our entity. So we need to configure those. So remember in the Introduction to C# class, we overrode methods like toString and equals. So we're going to do something very similar here. We're going to override on model creating, and we can get rid of this on line 13. So what are we going to do here? Well, remember for our lights, we want to have a primary key that is a composite key. And in order to do that, we have to override this on model creating and specify how we should create that key. Right? So to do that, we say model builder dot entity of type light rather dot as key, and we're gonna just pass in a like to this lambda, and we're gonna return an anonymous type. And the reason we're doing that is it would be really tedious to like go here and public record like composite key good post ID string user handle, right? We could do this. New like composite key like dot post ID like dot user handle. We could do this, but this is only ever going to be used right here, and we don't need to do that. That's a little bit extra code that we really just don't need to write. So what we can do instead is an anonymous type, since it's only used here. So we say new, then curly braces, then we say like dot post ID like dot user handle. And that will tell Entity Framework that our like entity has a key that contains the post ID and the user handle, right? So there's one more thing we want to configure here. So if we look at our we look at our post, we see we have text and it's just a string. You notice we never specified a maximum length. Well, this is a microblogging API, so we want to have, small blocks, small posts. So let's go into our context, and we can configure that here. We can say model builder.entity post dot property, right? We're going to say it's a property because we're going to be configuring a property of the post. And we pass in our post to the lambda, and we just need to select the correct property, which is post.text. And then we can say dot has max length of 240. All right. So now our context is fully configured. We have our two tables here, and we have our two rules for our two entities. So now we just need to do a couple more things, and we will be fully up and running. The first thing we need to do is we need to add another NuGet package to our project here. And the one we need is Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.design. So we do .NET add Microsoft.NET add package Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.design. And you'll see again, it's compatible with all the specified frameworks in project. Great. So then we need a database server to host our database. And if you remember, we're going to be doing that with Docker. So let's go over here into the Postgres documentation. And you see here, they've got just a command to run a Postgres server. So we're just going to copy this, go into our terminal, and paste it on in here. Now, I'm on Linux. If you're on Mac, you'll have to do this as well, probably. You do sudo in front of this command, run it as root. We're going to name it, not some Postgres, but Microblogger Postgres server. And then we're going to set a password to be Postgres. All right, so let's go over this command really quick. This is not a Docker course. You probably won't be a Docker expert by the time we get over with this course, but I do want you to understand this command I'm having you run because you shouldn't just run random commands that some guy on the internet is telling you to run. So sudo means run it as root. Docker, we're invoking the Docker program. Then run, we're just going to run a Docker container. It's going to be named microblogger-postgres-server. The environment variable Postgres password is going to be equal to Postgres. We're going to run it in detached mode, and we want to run the image Postgres. Now, one more thing we need to do is we need to specify -p 5432:5432. And what that does is it forwards port 5432 from your computer into the Docker container. Right, so let's go ahead and run that. And we got back an ID, which means it should be successful. So let's go ahead and run sudo docker ps. And you can see it was created 6 seconds ago, and it's been up for 6 seconds, and we've got the forwarded ports. All right. Now, if you're on Windows, you won't need to use sudo, but you may need to run these commands from inside an administrator command prompt or PowerShell. All right. So now that we've got that up and running, we can install another extension into VS Code. We need to search for Postgres because that's the kind of database we want to interact with. And I like this one. So I'm going to install it. And there we go. Now you see we have this Postgres Explorer down here. We're going to add a connection to localhost. Our username will be Postgres because that's the default. Then our password will be Postgres because we set it to that. We're going to use the port 5432, and we're going to use a standard connection. We're going to show all databases, and it's going to be named localhost. All right, so as you can see, we only have this Postgres database, which has this public schema, and it doesn't really have a whole lot going on. So what we can do is we can specify a connection string to tell our application how to talk to the database server. So inside of appsettings.development.json, and make sure you're doing it in .development.json, not appsettings.json. The reason is we only want this connection string exposed in our development environment. We don't want it to be copied over to like production or staging or any other environment. We only want it in development. So you do a comma here, connection strings, then we're going to say Postgres. It doesn't have to be Postgres. This is just the name of the connection string. I just name it Postgres. Then we say host equals localhost. Database is equal to microblogger db. Username is equal to Postgres. And password is equal to Postgres. I chose Postgres as the password because I feel like if you're doing local development on your local machine, you should have a very easy to remember password because you're going to be typing it a decent amount. If I were using an actual development environment, like with a hosted development box, then I would be using a complex password. But since this is all just running on my local machine, I like to use the simple password. All right, so that's our connection string configured. Let's go ahead and use it. So open up program.cs, and right here where it says add services to the container, that's exactly what we're going to do. Now, don't worry if this doesn't make too much sense just yet. We're going to be going over dependency injection in an upcoming video, I think the next one. So all we do is we do builder.services, so we're going to be accessing the services container. To add DB context, because we're adding a database context, right? Of type microblogger context. Now in here, we can pass in an options lambda. Remember, because inside of our microblogger context, we're taking in these DB context options. So let's look at this options object. It is of type DB context options builder. So what that means is we can use this options object to build our options that will be passed on to the microblogger context. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So first things first, we're going to say options.useNPGSQL. That's how you tell it to use Postgres. And then we're going to pass in a connection string. specifically the connection string that we configured inside of appsettings.development.json. So how do we access that? Well, to access your appsettings.whatever.json, you just do builder.configuration, right? Then get connection string here. And the reason that we named this connection strings is because when we call get connection string, it knows to look inside of the connection strings object. And we named our connection string Postgres. And we're going to drop an exclamation mark here to let it know this will not be null. This will always be provided to you. All right, then we want just a couple more things. First off, we need a flag to tell us if we're in development mode. Is development is equal to builder.environment. This is how we get information about the environment we're running in, is builder.environment is development, right? And then what we can do is we can do enable sensitive data logging. Now the default value in here is true, right? So it will always log out sensitive data. We don't want that. We only want to log out sensitive data if we're in development mode. So that's why I have this is development flag above. We can just say is development. Then we can say options.enable detailed errors. And we're also going to pass in is development here because, again, the default value is true, and I only really want those detailed errors if we're in development mode. All right. So with that, we only have to do a couple more things, and we're done with this video. So we've got our microblogger context that has our tables, and it has our onModel creating to specify the rules for our entities. We have this database context added to our services container with options like what connection string we're going to use, what kind of logging we want. So now we just need to create our migration and apply it. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop back down into the terminal, and we're going to say .NET tool install-g .NET-EF. So .NET-EF is the entity framework suite of tools that enables us to do stuff like create migrations, apply the migrations, all that good stuff. So we're just going to run this. -g means install it globally on my system. So you should only have to do this once. All right. So now we have the .NET-EF tools installed. Now we can run our .NET-EF commands. So .NET-EF, and we're going to be working with migrations here. Migrations are what tells Entity Framework how to configure your database structure. So .NET-EF migrations, and we're going to be adding one, and we're going to name it initial version of posts and links, or something like that. It should be descriptive enough for you to know what it is when you go back to review it. And then we're going to output it. Remember, we've been putting all of our data-related stuff inside of this data folder, so we're going to continue that here, data/migrations. All right, so let's go ahead and run that. All right, so now you see here inside of data, we have this new migrations folder. Let's take a look. So you see here, initial version of posts and likes. So this is our migration. Now a migration has two methods. It has an up and a down. So up is run when we update our database, right? Everything inside of this up method will be executed against our database when we update it for the first time or anytime we need to apply this migration. And then down, it does the opposite. If we were to roll back a migration, roll back this migration specifically, then down would be run. So let's take a look at up. What does it do? Well, first it creates a table called posts with these columns: ID, text, user handle, is published, created at, last edited at. And you can see here the text has a character limit of 240, which is exactly what we configured. Then we've got a primary key. Remember I said the convention was that the ID field would be our primary key, which is true here. And then we're going to create another table called likes. and it has our post ID and our user handle. And then we have our constraints, which is the primary key, which again is this post ID and user handle, just like we specified before. It's even an anonymous type like we specified before. And then we have a foreign key, and it goes from our post ID to the posts.id field. This onDelete referential cascade, what that means is if we delete a post, it will also delete all of the likes associated with that post, which makes sense. If a post doesn't exist in our database anymore, why would we keep its likes around, right? We wouldn't. And that's it. That's all this up is doing, is it's creating our two tables with our keys. All right, so what does down do? Well, remember, it should do the exact opposite of what up does. So here it just deletes the two tables, because at the end of the day, that will also delete any of the foreign keys or any of the constraints on the tables, because the tables will no longer exist. All right, great. Oops. Let's go ahead and run our migrations. Right, so how do you do that? It's pretty straightforward. We just say .NET EF database, because now we're interacting with our database, and we're going to update it. So we run the update command. All right, so the first thing it did is say, hey, we can't connect to the database microblogger_db. That's because it didn't exist. So you see the first command it runs is create database microblogger_db. All right, so let's go over to Postgres and right-click on localhost here and hit refresh items. You see now we have this microblogger_db database. Great. So we expand the public schema. We have our likes table, which has our post ID and our user handle. And we have our posts table, which has ID, text, user handle, is published, created at, and last edited at. And then we have this extra table, ___ EF migrations history. That's got a migration ID, which is this full name of the migration with the timestamp and everything, the 2024 1125 blah 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 initial version of posts and likes. And then it has a product version, which is just the version of the entity framework tools that applied the migration. So great, we have a database and it's fully configured for what we need. And yeah, you can see here all of the SQL when we ran our migration got logged out to the console, which is great. That would allow us to troubleshoot any kind of SQL missteps. Yeah, that is going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Our upcoming video will be about the dependency injection and services layer. So I will catch you in the next one.